Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. Today, let's talk about inflation and why it is not likely to be going away anytime soon. Now, we've been hearing a lot about disinflation lately from Fed Chair Jerome Powell, the disinflation that we are currently witnessing in the economy. And that term, disinflation, basically what that means is inflation, but at a decreasing pace. And this is a buzzword that Powell mentioned more than 10 times during last week's post FOMC press conference. And then it came up again at a talk that Powell was giving yesterday before the Economic Club of Washington. And according to Jerome Powell, disinflation is now in its early stages, and he appears hopeful that this is a trend which is going to continue. But in today's video, I want to cover 3 reasons that I believe this disinflation trend is only temporary, and why I think inflation will soon rear its ugly head once again, and why I am still stacking inflation hedging assets like physical silver. And speaking of silver, today's video is brought to you by Silver Botanicals and their amazing line of household and personal hygiene products powered by Nano Silver. You can check them out with the link down in the description, and don't forget to use coupon code STACKER to save 10% on your order. Now, before we dive into these 3 reasons why inflation is likely to head much higher before this economic cycle is finished, let's take a quick look at the price of a few commodities. First, today's silver chart, courtesy of SD Bullion, my preferred source for precious metals. You can see that silver is catching a small bid today, although it hasn't recovered from the big drop that we got on Friday's release of the surprisingly good non-farm payroll numbers. And in gold, it is a very similar story. But if we take a look at crude oil, on the other hand, it too had a pretty significant drop on those job numbers, but it has had a very strong recovery since, and it's now actually trading higher than before that drop. Now that leads us into the first reason today why inflation is likely to be a persistent problem, and that is deglobalization and the continued breakdown of global supply chains. So it was back in November that the EU launched its embargo against Russian crude oil, but just a few days ago on February 5th, that embargo was expanded in scale to cover Russian refined petroleum products as well, such as diesel fuel. And previously, the EU had been importing a significant portion of its diesel fuel from Russia. Now it's going to need to find alternative suppliers, and that could include the US. Now, this specific development, it doesn't ensure higher inflation by any means, but it is just one piece of the deglobalization puzzle. And as a whole, this trend simply means a less efficient global economy. As goods stop exchanging hands and crossing borders because of political considerations and sanctions, it means price levels in certain regions are going to be moving higher. And while moves like this embargo may harm Russian revenues, it could also mean higher prices for fuel and energy in the West than we would have otherwise had. But perhaps of more concern should be the recent call by a senior Ukrainian lawmaker for the US to impose secondary sanctions on India and China if they continue to purchase Russian energy. Now, there's certainly no guarantee that some plan like this is going to be moving forward anytime soon, but the mere fact that the idea is being floated should be of some concern, and it's not like it would be without precedent. The US has already launched tech sanctions on China, prohibiting the export of advanced semiconductors, but energy sanctions against the country that is essentially the world's factory could be much more problematic. The US imports a tremendous amount of manufactured goods from China, and in exchange, China receives a trade surplus of US dollars. It's a currency that they are increasingly less interested in holding. That's why China has been dumping US treasuries to the tune of more than $100 billion over the past year. And US-China relations, they're already at a low point following the whole balloon gate thing. And if the economic warfare heats up between the US and China, it is going to mean much higher prices for imported goods in the US. Now, as far as India goes, so far, one of the factors that has actually prevented the EU's existing embargo against Russian crude from pushing fuel prices sky high is the fact that India has been purchasing the Russian crude oil, refining it into fuel, and then exporting that to the EU and the US. If new sanctions crack down on India and this practice, we could witness significant upward pressure on the price of fuel in the West. And another factor to consider here before the US engages in sanctions on India is that India holds more than $200 billion in US treasuries. They join the bandwagon of dumping US debt along with China. That could mean much higher bond yields in the US, an increased cost of borrowing, and an increasing likelihood that the Fed may need to intervene in U.S. debt markets. Now, the potential for a U.S. debt crisis that already exists without China and India dumping more U.S. treasuries, and that's why even if everyone around the world suddenly starts to hold hands and sing kumbaya, we don't see any more sanctions, inflation is still likely to continue to rise because of the massive levels of indebtedness in the US. And that is the second reason that inflation is likely to continue to increase, because pretty much every sector of the US economy has way too much debt. Consumers, students, businesses, government agencies, all of them are levered up to the hilt right now. We've got credit card debt hitting record highs as consumers are pressured by inflation to rely on credit to make ends meet. We've got a $31.5 trillion national debt, $180 trillion in unfunded liabilities. I mean, the list goes on. And this is largely the result of the ultra-loose monetary policy of the Fed following the 2008 financial crisis. They kept rates artificially low. Rates were near zero for years, and as a result, a lot of debt was taken on because, interest rates, they're a price, they're a cost of borrowing. And if you hold them down artificially, consumers, governments, businesses, they're going to be taking on more debt. It's a pretty simple formula. And once a debt bubble like the one we have has been inflated, there's really no easy way out, because once you go on a bender, you can't avoid the hangover. And the vast majority of this debt, it simply cannot be paid off, at least not without the dollar being significantly devalued first. And when faced with a decision between debt defaults or more inflation, everything in the history of central banking would indicate that the Fed will choose the inflationary path. We also need to keep in mind that as of now, the debts are still being accumulated. That is a very important point. When Powell talks about the disinflationary process that's beginning to take shape in the US economy as a result of tighter Fed monetary policy, he seems to completely ignore the out-of-control fiscal policy on the part of the US federal government. Because no matter how high the Fed raises rates, and to be honest, they'd probably need to be a lot higher than they are right now to really fight the kind of inflation we're experiencing, that fight will ultimately be doomed if Congress continues to authorize spending that is financed by trillions of dollars of borrowing. And Powell actually commented on this briefly in his talk at the Economic Club of Washington yesterday when he was asked about the $31.5 trillion national debt. Just listen to what he had to say.
What about the total debt of the United States, which produces some inflation, 31.4, leaving aside the debt limit? Are you worried about the total indebtedness of the United States producing inflation, or you don't think that's a big problem?
Yeah, it's not the level of debt. I would say the thing I'd say about the level of debt is really, it's not, first of all, it's not the Fed's job, but I would say that we're on an unsustainable fiscal path at the federal government level. That has been the case for some time, and it's something we will have to deal with. And it's better to deal with it sooner rather than later.
Talk about ignoring the elephant in the room. Yeah, we need to deal with it. And how's that going to work out? How can you possibly talk about solving the inflation problem without first discussing how to deal with this gargantuan level of indebtedness? And if you ask me, the likelihood that Congress is ever going to resolve this debt problem is basically zero, because there's simply no political path forward when you have an electorate that has become dependent on government programs and spending. Instead, the debt ceiling is just going to continue to get raised, spending will continue to run out of control, and then eventually the Fed will probably be forced to deal with this problem itself at some point, and that'll be by monetizing the U.S. national debt. Now, how will that work in practice? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can envision something along the lines of the U.S. Treasury issuing $31.5 trillion in zero-interest 100-year bonds and the Fed just buying them up. Problem solved, right? Of course, that would mean massive inflation, but again, with this level of debt, one of two things is already baked into the cake: a debt default or currency debasement. And I don't think it's too hard to forecast which path the Fed and Washington are going to choose when push comes to shove. And so as long as this unsustainable fiscal policy remains unaddressed, any disinflation that we experience, it's going to be transitory. And of course, we all know how good Powell is at forecasting the transitory nature of inflation. Now, the third reason that inflation is likely to be a persistent problem in the US, it ties directly into the first problem we covered, deglobalization, and that is rising geopolitical tensions and de-dollarization around the world. Because over the past 5 decades or so, the US has benefited tremendously from the dollar status as the world's reserve currency. That status, combined with the petrodollar system, in which the OPEC nations, led by Saudi Arabia, price their oil exports exclusively in US dollars, it's allowed the US to flood the world with greenbacks, borrow vast sums incredibly cheaply, and export the majority of our inflation. But now, in 2023, the end of the unipolar world order and the bifurcation of the global financial system threatens all of that. Right now, we're only in the month of February, and already this year, Saudi Arabia has floated the idea of accepting non-dollar currencies for oil. The BRICS nations have announced that they'll be making moves towards a new alternative reserve currency at their August summit in South Africa, and central banks around the world continue to accumulate gold at the fastest pace in decades, with China recently announcing the addition of another 15 tons to their official gold reserves in January. And these developments, they are the result of the rising geopolitical tensions around the world and also the weaponization of the US dollar, which shows no sign of abating as we move forward. The risk of the conflict in Ukraine expanding into a broader global conflict, it's never been higher, and warfare is one of the most costly and inflationary endeavors a state can engage in. I mean, even if you win the war, it's not good for your currency. Just look at Britain following World War I and World War II. I mean, sure, they won both of those conflicts, but despite that fact, the high cost of those wars and the indebtedness that resulted, it caused the pound to lose its status as the world reserve currency. And unfortunately, that may ultimately also be the fate of the US dollar system that we currently have. Now, fortunately for us stackers, gold and silver are assets which have never lost their status as stores of value over thousands of years of history. That's why I still view them as a tremendous bargain at today's prices. It's not financial advice, just sharing with you my thoughts. And I'd love to know what you think about these developments. Will disinflation take hold? Are we going to continue to see prices fall? Or do you think it's just a temporary phenomenon? Is inflation going to begin ticking up again soon? Leave me a comment down below to let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, everybody. Stay safe and happy stacking. Smart Silver Stacker, out.